The report arrived at the Conclave Central Archives 17 days after the Vethara station incident, and the archivist who received it did not sleep for the 3 nights following. Not because of what the report confirmed, because of what it couldn't explain. She flagged it with a priority designation that hadn't been used in 400 years, a classification so rarely invoked that 2 junior analysts initially assumed the symbol was a formatting error. It wasn't. The symbol meant in the oldest translation of conclave administrative language, something has changed and we do not yet understand what. She transmitted it upward through 11 layers of bureaucratic hierarchy without a single accompanying note. There was nothing she could write. Every sentence she attempted came out wrong, too small for what she was trying to say, too certain about things she wasn't certain about at all. The report sat in the chamber of the high determinants for 6 hours before anyone opened it. When they did, the first thing they saw was a timestamp, then a velocity figure, then a silence that lasted, by later account, almost 4 minutes. Maren Voss had not slept in 31 hours when the Calliope dropped out of transit 17 kilometers off Vethara Station's eastern docking array, running on emergency power and transmitting on a frequency that no vessel had used since the Conclave formally retired the old emergency band 2 centuries ago. She was using it because it was the only band she knew wouldn't be jammed. She had planned for jamming. She had planned for a lot of things. What she hadn't fully planned for was still being alive. The Calliope was a survey-class research vessel, unarmed, with a crew manifest that listed 3 names, of which only one, hers, was still breathing. She had not told Station Control this yet. She had not told Station Control very much at all. She had simply broadcast her identification code, requested emergency docking clearance, and then sat in the pilot's chair in a pressure suit that had a slow leak in the left shoulder seal, watching the fuel gauge read numbers that were technically impossible. The Calliope had traveled farther than it had fuel to travel. This was the first thing the Vethara station traffic controllers noticed, and they flagged it as a sensor error. Sensor errors happened. Ships arrived with anomalous readings all the time, especially survey vessels operating in deep fringe space where radiation interference could corrupt telemetry data. They cleared her for docking bay 7 and dispatched a maintenance crew. Then they looked at her transit log. The maintenance crew was recalled. A different team was sent, not engineers. The kind of team that wore plain gray uniforms and carried equipment that didn't have labels on it. Maren watched them approach through the docking bay's internal cameras, and she recognized what they were immediately, because she had grown up near a conclave administrative hub, and she had seen that kind of uniform before on days when something had happened that the conclave hadn't yet decided how to categorize. She sealed the Calliope's interior hatch, not because she was afraid of them, because she needed 3 more minutes to finish what she was doing. She was writing a transmission, not to the conclave. Not to any government body. To a university on a Planet 6 transit jumps away, addressed to a specific researcher in a specific department, containing a data package of exactly 4.7 terabytes, compressed and encoded with a key that only that researcher would have. She sent it before the gray uniformed team finished cycling through the outer airlock. Then she sat back and she let them in, and when the lead officer asked her, very calmly, very precisely, to explain the transit log, she looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been awake for 31 hours and has in that time crossed a boundary they cannot uncross, and she said, "Which part?" The conclave's understanding of faster-than-light travel was not a theory. It was a proof. This distinction mattered enormously to them, and it had mattered for 340 years, which was how long ago the proof had been established by a coalition of 17 species working across 9 star systems in the most collaborative scientific endeavor in recorded history. The proof was elegant. It was comprehensive. It described, with perfect mathematical precision, the fundamental boundary conditions of transit travel, the relationship between mass, energy, and the substrate of folded space through which transit drives operated. It explained why transit jumps required fixed-point navigation, why the maximum range of a single jump was bounded, why certain regions of space, gravitationally complex, heavily warped, threaded with anomalous dark matter density gradients, were impassable by transit drive and always would be. The proof had a name. Most species referred to it in their own languages, but the common tongue conclave designation was the Kethavari limit, after the Davari mathematician who had contributed the final unifying equation. In 340 years, no experiment had contradicted it. No observation had strained it. It was the kind of settled, comfortable fact that stopped feeling like knowledge and started feeling like furniture, present, unquestioned, part of the shape of the room. Humans had been members of the conclave for 61 years. They had reviewed the Kethavari proof upon admission as all new members did. They had offered no objections. They had asked several questions that the reviewing board found mildly unusual. Not wrong, just oddly focused on edge cases, on boundary conditions, on what the proof assumed rather than what it demonstrated. But the board had answered the questions and filed the session notes and moved on. That session had taken place 58 years ago. The Calliope's transit log showed a jump of a kind the Kethavari proof said could not occur. Not an inaccurate jump, not a lucky jump through favorable conditions. A transit through a region of space that the proof explicitly identified as impassable, a region so gravitationally complex that any drive field attempting to initiate there would collapse within microseconds, destroying the vessel before transit could complete. The Kethavari proof didn't say this region was difficult. It said in the precise language of mathematical proof that it was impossible. The Calliope had transited through it in 11 minutes and 43 seconds. The gray-uniformed officer who interviewed Marin Voss was not a scientist. He was an investigator. He was very good at his job, which was why he did not immediately ask her how. He asked her instead something more careful. He asked her why. She looked at the table between them for a long moment. There was a small scratch in the surface of the table, a thin line barely visible running diagonally across the corner nearest to her. She had been looking at it periodically throughout the interview. The officer noticed this and made a note, though he was not sure yet what the note meant. Because it was faster, she said. Through a region that transit physics says is impassable. Through a region that the Kethavari proof models as impassable, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not correcting him exactly, but drawing a distinction with the careful patience of someone who had thought about the difference for a very long time. Models are not the same as reality. They're the best description of reality we have at the time we make them. The officer wrote something, looked up. Where is the rest of your crew? The scratch in the table. The leak in her shoulder seal, which she'd patched with material cut from Domings's spare suit because she'd used her own patching kit 3 weeks earlier when the hull integrity monitor in Junction 4 had started reading false negatives and she'd needed to check every seal junction manually in the suit in hard vacuum over the course of 11 hours. Domings had told her she was being paranoid. She had not argued with him, she had just checked the seals. Domings had been wrong about the paranoia and right about most everything else, and she missed him with a specific physical weight that she was not at this moment prepared to examine. There was an incident, she said, during the approach transit, the drive reconfiguration we were testing. It's not stable at the far end. We knew it wasn't stable. That was part of what we were studying. She paused. They knew the risks. And I knew the risks too. The officer looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, something adjacent to discomfort or perhaps to an emotion that didn't have a clean equivalent in the Conclave's common tongue. He was Davari. His people had contributed the final equation of the proof that she had, depending on how you looked at it, either violated or corrected. She wondered if he understood that. She suspected he did. The Kethavari limit, he said, is foundational to every transit system in conclave space, every navigation algorithm, every safety protocol, every ship. If what your log records is accurate, it's accurate. Then the implications are, he stopped, reorganized. This will require verification. I sent all the data to Dr. Fenley at Ostrava Institute before your team boarded, she said. The full technical package. 6 hours ago, more or less, it's already there. The officer was very still for a moment, in the way that people are still when they are recalculating something important. Why? Because, Marin said, and her voice was very quiet and very even, if I only gave it to you it might not go anywhere. And it needs to go somewhere. What we found, it's not a trick, it's not a weapon, it's a door. And doors don't become dangerous because you open them. They become dangerous if you're the only one who knows they exist. The data reached Ostrava Institute in 6 hours and 20 minutes. Dr. Yella Fenley opened it at 2 in the morning local time, because she had a habit of checking her research messages before sleep that she had never successfully broken. She read the cover note first, 3 sentences, no signature, using a phrasing that Fenley recognized from a conversation she and Marin had had years earlier, during a conference in a hallway, at the kind of late hour when people say things they actually mean. The note confirmed the encryption key. It confirmed the data was what Marin had called it in that hallway when she described what she was trying to find. And it said one other thing at the end that Fenley read 3 times before she understood it fully. The Kethavari limit is a description of equilibrium conditions. We operated outside equilibrium. The proof isn't wrong, it's just not complete. There's a region the math doesn't describe because the original researchers never had reason to look there. The assumption of drive field stability below a certain energy threshold was never tested because no one expected to survive testing it. We survived, barely. The data explains why. What you do with it is your problem now. I'm sorry to make it your problem. There wasn't another option that I liked better. Fenley sat in her office for a long time. She was Savathi, a species that processed complex information somewhat differently than humans. She experienced what humans would call an emotional response to intellectual discovery, as a kind of physical pressure behind her secondary respiratory membranes, a sensation her people had words for but most other species found difficult to understand when she tried to explain it. She felt that pressure now strongly, but layered underneath it was something else, something that wasn't excitement. Something that was, if she was honest, closer to fear, not because of what the data said, because of what it implied about what the humans had been doing for 58 years. The Conclave convened an emergency scientific committee 7 days after the Calliope's arrival at Vethara Station. This was, by Conclave standards, extraordinarily fast. The committee included 43 researchers from 11 species, access to the full transit log and sensor data from the Calliope, and a mandate to determine, as precisely as possible, what had happened and whether it could be replicated. They did not include a human researcher in the initial committee. This was not an oversight. The committee chair, a Rathani physicist named Sovath who had published extensively on Kethavari mechanics, made the decision deliberately, noting that the investigation required objectivity and that human researchers might have a conflict of interest given that the breakthrough, if real, originated with a human crew. This reasoning was accepted by the committee without significant debate. Fenley, who had been informally briefed, heard about the committee's composition and felt that pressure behind her membranes again, different now, edged differently. She transmitted a careful, professionally worded objection to the committee chair and received a response that acknowledged her concern and thanked her for her diligence. She did not transmit again. Instead, she spent 4 days reviewing the data Marin had sent her, not the summary, the raw telemetry, the drive field logs, the navigational sensor streams, with the particular kind of patient attention that her people were known for and that she had spent 40 years developing. She mapped every anomaly. She cross-referenced the drive field behavior against the Kethavari equations in their original form, not the simplified versions that had propagated through textbooks. And she found something that made the pressure behind her membranes so intense she had to sit very still for a moment and breathe slowly through both sets of airways. The original proof had a footnote. A footnote in the appendix of Kethavari's supplementary materials, published 2 years after the main proof and largely overlooked because the main proof was so complete that the supplementary materials felt like formality. The footnote described a class of drive field behavior that Kethavari had considered theoretically possible but practically irrelevant. Conditions so far outside normal operating parameters that no crew would survive to observe them. He had called it a boundary curiosity and moved on. The Calliope's drive logs described exactly those conditions, not approximately, exactly. Marin Voss hadn't discovered something new. She had gone somewhere that a Devari mathematician had seen 340 years ago marked as unreachable and moved on. She had gone there because she was willing to not survive it. She had designed a drive configuration that operated in conditions where survival was not guaranteed, tested it in the region of space most likely to destroy her, and come back, with 2 fewer crew members and a transit log that made the impossible concrete and specific and real. Fenley stared at the footnote for a very long time. She thought about the questions human researchers had asked at the Conclave admission review, 58 years ago. The questions about edge cases and boundary conditions and what the proof assumed. She thought about how long 58 years was. About what you could learn in 58 years if you were very patient and very quiet and very willing to test things that other people had decided not to test. She thought about Marin Voss sitting in the docking bay, in a pressure suit with a patched shoulder seal, sending a data package before anyone could stop her. She thought about the way Marin had said barely. The committee completed its preliminary review in 11 days, and issued a finding that the Calliope's transit log was consistent with actual observations and not with sensor error or data corruption. This finding was, in the dry language of scientific committees, almost unreadable as the extraordinary thing it was. What it meant, stripped of hedging and qualification, was that the Kethavari limit had a hole in it. Not a large hole, not an easy hole. A hole that required operating a transit drive in conditions that would kill most crews before they could complete the transit. A hole that existed, in other words, precisely because it demanded a price that no one had previously been willing to pay. The galaxy heard this finding and began slowly to understand what it meant, not in terms of physics. The physics took longer to work through. There were implications that would take years to fully map, new navigational possibilities that would have to be modeled, new safety protocols, new engineering challenges. The physics was complicated. What the galaxy began to understand, slowly and with a particular quality of discomfort, was something else, something about the humans. About what it meant that a species had spent 58 years looking at a proof that everyone else had accepted as complete and asking quietly about the edges. About what it meant that the answer to the question how did they do it was not superior technology or unique biological advantage or fortunate accident, but rather something that translated in almost every language to the same phrase: they were willing to lose people finding out. The Conclave had assumed limits and built civilization inside them. The humans had looked at the limits and asked what happened if you kept going anyway. Marin Voss was released from Conclave administrative custody after 19 days. There were conditions on her release: travel restrictions, a requirement to remain available for continued inquiry, certain restrictions on publication that her legal counsel advised her to contest and that she did not contest. She signed what they asked her to sign. She did not argue, she was very tired. The last thing the investigating officer said to her in the room with the scratch table was not a question. It was an observation offered in the careful way of someone who has been thinking about something for 19 days and has finally found the words. My people contributed the final equation, he said. We were very proud of it. You should be, Marin said. It's a beautiful proof. It is also apparently incomplete. Yes. He looked at the table, at the scratch she'd been looking at across 19 days of intermittent interviews. Did you know before you went that you would find what you found? Marin was quiet for a moment. Through the room's single window, she could see the docking array, not Bay 7, which was still restricted, but the outer edge of the northern arm, where ordinary traffic moved in ordinary patterns. Ships jumping to and from places that were known, safe, well mapped, connected by transit lanes that 300 years of careful engineering had made reliable and predictable and comfortable. No, she said, I thought we might find something, I didn't know what. And if you'd known the cost, he stopped, adjusted. If you had known precisely what it would require, she looked at him. There were things she could say, true things. She could say that Domings had known and Carver had known, and they had all discussed it in the small hours of a transit crossing 3 months before departure, in the Calliope's common room with bad coffee going cold in their cups, and they had arrived together at an answer. She could say that the answer hadn't felt like bravery at the time, it had felt like math, like a calculation with variables they couldn't all quantify, and they'd made their best estimates and accepted the uncertainty. She could say that she thought about it every day and that some days she thought they'd made the right choice and other days she wasn't sure she'd ever be sure. She didn't say any of this. I'd have gone, she said simply. He looked at her for a long time with that expression she still couldn't fully read. Davari faces carried emotions she hadn't spent enough years learning. But she thought in that moment that whatever the expression was, it wasn't contempt and it wasn't admiration and it wasn't quite fear. It was something closer to the feeling you have when you look at the universe and realize it is larger than the map you've been using. She picked up her bag. She walked out. Outside, on the station's public concourse, the ordinary business of conclave space moved around her. Dozens of species, hundreds of voices, the low hum of a civilization that had built itself, carefully and rationally and well, inside a set of limits it believed were absolute. People who had looked at the Kethavari limit and seen a wall, and who had reasonably intelligently turned around. Marin walked through them toward the transit terminal. She was already thinking about where to go next.